movement. And now we are going to welcome our second speaker for this session, Dr. Kelly Kilpatrick. So Dr. Kelly Kilpatrick is an affiliate lecturer at the University of Glasgow and a research fellow at the University of Oxford. And the paper she's going to present today expands from a research project and fellowship that was funded by the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 2011. And we're very much looking forward to hearing your paper.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a delight to speak to you all on this very exciting occasion. And I'm quite glad as well from listening to John Borland's paper just before me, because you'll now be familiar with a lot of the imagery and the crosses that I'm going to talk about. So I'm really excited to talk to you about the iconography of the Conan stone, a monument who we all know is of immense significance, and the exceptional carvings of this monument offer us vital new insights into Pictish culture and beliefs. So as the Conan stone was lifted from the ground, the carvings on the reverse face were immediately recognized as having links to monuments in Perthshire. But on the left side of the stone beneath the symbols, we have already noticed that there is this crouching human figure, and he holds a sword in one hand and he holds a round shield in the other. But his head is not exactly human. Its opponent to the right of it, is a half horse, half human creature, and in its hands it holds axes. The hybrid man is almost identical to a figure on the Merthley panel from Perthshire that we've already mentioned today. But the heads of both the Conan stone and the Merthley panel have notable similarities with the earlier incised figure from Mael in Shetland, which you can see at the bottom of the stone. In Pictish sculpture, these figures are found on incised unshaped monuments, or what we typically refer to as Class 1, and on relief carved cross slabs with Pictish symbols, which we usually call Class 2, and those without Pictish symbols, what we call Class 3. Like John, I too am not very keen on this terminology, but it works for the purposes of classifications, and so I'll use it throughout this talk. But these images occur from Class 1 stones right the way through to Class 2 and 3, which indicates that these motifs or these images had a chronologically long significance in Pictish art and culture. Examples of bird-headed hybrid men are found on the stone from Papal in Shetland, on Hunter's Hill in Glamis, at Rossie Priory, and in Merthley in Perthshire. And this other example from a Meagle cross slab might belong in this category as well. It doesn't hold a weapon like the others do, but it's got an unusual head. And the now lost, there is a relief carved fragment from Strathmartin in Angus, which may belong in this category as well. Now, there are also a number of male figures with prominent or maybe unusual facial features holding axes or clubs. And there are two battling one another on the Glamis Manse stone. We've already seen that there's one on Golspie. And then there are some other incised examples from Riney, from Mael in Shetland, and one in Balblair. And these, where they occur alone, they're sometimes referred to as the formidable man, and sometimes have been considered to be potentially distinct Pictish symbols. Now, there are differences between all of these figures, but they are connected either by their appearance or by the objects they hold. But what do they signify? Comparisons have been drawn between the Papal Birdman with the Temptation of St. Anthony, and this was a common scene on Irish high crosses, and it reflects an episode from the life of St. Anthony in which the saint was tempted by women who disguised themselves as birds and whispered into his ear. Now, the identity of this scene on Irish high crosses is reasonably certain. These occur in sculptural programs that have other carvings depicting Saint Anthony and Saint Paul. But close analysis of the papal stone reveals that there never was a body attached to the head in this damaged section between the bird's beaks. So they're just holding a head between their beaks. There was never a body there, because you can see how they've also bothered to carve the arm of the birdman there. They also carry axes over their shoulders, like other hybrid Pictish figures, and they wear a man's tunic, which suggests that they're probably not women. It's difficult to equate these figures with early Christian visual and literary imagery. They've sometimes been described as monsters and demons, and another theory suggests that they are depictions of real men, perhaps shamans or performers, wearing masks and holding ritual axes. Now, I have to confess, I've not found any of these suggestions altogether convincing. I think it's quite plausible that the male figure is wearing a mask, so the one down here on the bottom right, that could potentially be hair extending from underneath a mask. But if the figure on male and the Conan stone are the same or related in any way, the Conan hybrid warrior is depicted in combat with a half-human, half-horse creature. Beneath them are beasts that do not look like real animals. And one could argue that the figure on the Mirthly panel fights another masked opponent, the one with the bird head. But the remainder of the frieze depicts two hippocamps, a horse-fish hybrid, followed by a hybrid sea creature and a man about to be eaten by a monstrous four-legged animal. Nothing about the iconography of the Mirthly or the Conan stones is based on reality. Some years ago, my colleague Matthias Egeler noted similarities between the papal hybrids and the Morican, a mythological character who features in medieval Irish saga literature, and who likely originated in the pre-Christian belief system of Ireland as a goddess of death and battle. One of the Morican's three personas, so she was sort of a triple goddess who was also known as Bob, Nevin, and Macha. And now Macha is described in the literature as bloodying her mouth from feeding on human heads. The comparison between the papal hybrids and the Morican feels closer to the mark, but the Morican is female, and the clothing depicted on these Pictish figures is masculine, so it's commonly male tunics. After careful consideration of the evidence, I arrived at a different conclusion. These Pictish figures are not demons or monsters. They are not derived from Christian literature, nor are they the battlefield demons of early Irish mythology. These hybrid figures and mythical animals represent characters and events from Pictish mythology. A myth is a traditional story, usually involving supernatural beings and forces. Myth can be used to explain religious beliefs or rituals. It can be used to explain social history, natural phenomena, or the cosmos. Myth has a variety of applications. But characters in myth are often gods or goddesses, supernatural animals, or legendary individuals with superhuman abilities. This iconography is also geographically extensive. Although monuments with mythical image, Pictish monuments with mythical imagery are most common in southern Pictland, these motifs are found on monuments throughout Pictish areas, suggesting that their meaning had widespread popularity amongst the Picts. When I was first examining the axe brandishing figures over a decade ago, I realized that there are patterns on Pictish Christian sculpture when it comes to the inclusion of mythical imagery. The patterns suggest that these mythological images were intended to evoke specific narratives, so narratives from myth or stories that a Pictish audience would have been able to understand. So for example, on class 2 and 3 monuments, mythical imagery rarely occurs in isolation, but it occurs in carefully planned artistic programs that include, in addition to crosses and various other Christian iconographical scenes, Pictish symbols, and hunting scenes, they sometimes include similar mythical figures and beasts. Now, there is considerable variety in where they are carved on the monuments, which mythical creatures are included on the monuments, and how these mythical creatures are depicted. Some mythological animals are interlaced, which thus makes it more difficult for us to recognize them as part of these mythical scenes as opposed to just decoration. So, for example, framing beasts are found on the Conan stone above the cross, and we also have these framing beasts on Dunfermline, but they're on the other side. So it's the same motif, but it's on the other side, except this one has a man between their jaws. The mythological scene on the reverse of the Conan stone, we can see that this is here, and it's presented almost in like a frieze, where it takes up a certain section of the cross slab, whereas on the Dunfermline cross, the little mythical creatures and beings are placed around the cross and around the arms of the cross in panels. So with these concepts in mind, what I would like to do now is to share with you some examples of reoccurring categories of mythological motifs in Pictish Class 2 and Class 3 sculpture. Now, this is not going to be exhaustive. There's quite a lot of these, but I'll just go through and show you some so you get a sense of just how repetitive this imagery actually is. Now, following this, I'm going to do a brief comparison with another neighboring culture that also used blended pagan and Christian iconography. So we'll look at insular Scandinavian sculpture on crosses and cross slabs to show how mythology and Christianity could be blended in artwork to combine to have a meaningful combination. And after this, we're going to look at pre-Christian origins of this mythology on Pictish monuments. So on Class 2 and 3 monuments, these four middle men and hybrid men sometimes occur alone, such as at Gulspie, and sometimes they occur in pairs. So for example, on the Mirthly panel, Hunter's Hill, this is fragmented, but it was another a smaller bird-headed opponent. So the fact that they sometimes occur in pairs, this probably indicates that we're dealing with more than one mythological character. As we saw earlier, in John's paper, 3 examples depict cauldrons in relative proximity to these figures, notably on the Ulster stone, Conan, and the Glom's Manse stones. Now, this may refer to a specific mythical story, or it could also be used to identify these figures in some way. Cauldrons feature in several Indo-European myths. For example, in medieval Irish literature, the Dogda, who is the chief god of the Tuatha De Danann, a group of mythological invaders of Ireland, sort of a family of gods. He's one of the chief gods, and he carries a club, and he has a magic cauldron. These, what we sometimes call centaurs, human-horse hybrids, are found on a number of Pictish monuments. So, for example, we have one from the Maiden Stone, the Conan Stone, Glom's Manse, Aberlimno number 3, Meagle number 2, and one on the Ketton's Cross slab. Now, 4 of these are carrying these sort of, one's carrying a bearded axe, and these others are carrying T-shaped axes. And the example from Aberlimno and Meagle are carrying branches in their hands. I think these three quadrupeds or four-legged creatures with human heads, I think, are likely to represent the same concept as the centaur. And these are also all linked stylistically. So, for example, the sort of human-headed four-legged creatures on Dunfermline, Rossi Priory, and Gask. Human-horse hybrids, again, are not uncommon in Indo-European mythology. The Greek centaur is probably the first thing that springs to everyone's mind. There are 16 examples of intertwined or opposing hippocamps, is what they're commonly referred to. This is sort of a half-horse, half-fish hybrid creature. And these pairs, so these occur quite frequently in Pictish sculpture, and they usually face one another, or they are interlaced. So for example, this from the Meagle recumbent, this has ones that are quite similar to the Mirthly panel, and they both face one another. These could be the same motif at Mortlach, but some are also stylistically related. So for example, those from Aberlimno, Largo, Meagle #1, and there's another example here as well, where you can see they're both intertwined. Now, a fine interlaced example, you can just see it here, they're sort of biting one another's mouths, and they're interlaced here, is on the Cossins stone. And there is a repeated occurrence of these hippocamps on monuments with mythological imagery in Pictish sculpture, which suggests that they're probably more than just decoration. Horse and fish hybrids are also not uncommon in Indo-European mythology. The Greek god Poseidon, for example, has hippocamps, and the Scottish Kelpie might spring to mind. Now, the hippocamps that we've just seen are mostly benign creatures with horse heads, and they seem to come in pairs. But on some stones, there's a single marine hybrid creature that sometimes looks a bit more sinister, and some of them have quite a notable and pointed dorsal fin. So some examples of these are Mirthly. There's one from Teeling, Monifieth, and Dunfermline, and we can see that the one on Dunfermline has sharp, pointy teeth. Intertwined serpents are also commonly associated with this imagery. And some of them, it's difficult to tell if they are actually serpents or if they're other creatures. So for example, on Gulspie, you can see that this looks like a serpent, and this is how snakes are sometimes represented on the serpent and Zed-rod symbol. But this one here has a little snout and an ear, so it's presumably not necessarily it's possibly not intended to be a snake. Now, depictions of a man being chased or eaten by a mythical beast, these are quite common as well. And sometimes it's a large bear-type creature, for example, as on the Meagle recumbent and the one from Mirthly. So this is found on a number of class 2 and 3 cross slabs, and examples include Meagle, Woodray, Mirthly, Gask, and there are a few other examples as well. But by far of the entire sort of mythological corpus, the most common depiction in this sort of Pictish supernatural repertoire is the mythical quadruped or four-legged beast. And these often occur alone, or sometimes they occur in pairs. Occasionally there's lots of them on stones. Sometimes they're biting one another, and sometimes they're interlaced. But so on this slide, I have a list of some examples of where they occur, and this is probably not an exhaustive list. They're quite common. Now, they might have been intended to represent mythical bears, wolves, lions, or other four-legged predatory animals. And although there's considerable variation in how they're depicted, the majority are characterized by long curling tails and unusual feet. So for example, sometimes the tail commonly curves above the back, or sometimes it curls under the body. But their feet is one of the other things that kind of demonstrates that they're not real animals. So for example, some have 3 points, like this at Glom's Manse, and others have what I call a ball and extended claw type of foot. Now, some of these might have been intended to represent claws, and indeed on some of these claws are shown. So they were intended to represent, so some of them might be intended to represent claws. But one of the questions we might want to ask is, why do they all have weird paws? The Picts were perfectly capable of carving realistic animals with realistic paws or hooves, such as these Class 1 examples from Berghead, Granton, and Ardross. The unusual feat amongst the other attributes is a repetitive characteristic of these quadrupeds, and potentially what identifies them as supernatural. And I think it's possible that this representation or this type of foot may draw on pre-Celtic, pre-Christian Celtic religious imagery. Animals and mythical beasts are common in Iron Age and Celtic art, particularly on coinage and religious art. So for example, it's perhaps worth noting that this ball and extended claw type of foot is common in ancient Celtic depictions of mythical four-legged creatures, some of which have wings and which we might call griffins. So for example, this is the Gundestra Cauldron, which was likely made in Gaul. It was discovered in Denmark, and it probably dates to the mid 2nd to 1st century BC. But it was a religious vessel. Well, it likely served a religious function. And in the center of each plate, there is a central deity, either a god or a goddess, and they're surrounded by various objects or symbols, perhaps used to identify them, and lots of mythical animals. So for example, you can see that we still have that similar ball and claw foot there. And this imagery is also found on Celtic coinage, in Iron Age Celtic coinage, such as this example from Kent, which dates to the 1st century BC and AD. Now you can see with this example, it's got that same odd style of foot, and it probably was intended to have a wing, but it's not very obvious on this coin. And you can see there's a number of parallels between the way these mythical animals are presented in this earlier artwork with how they're shown on later Pictish monuments. So another common motif that we've talked about before in this conference is what I call these framing beasts. So these are 2 opposing mythical animals whose heads usually meet at the pinnacle of a cross slab on either the cross face or the reverse. On some cross slabs, they have either an entire man between their jaws or a man's head between their jaws, and the Conan stone is unique in having the interlace extend over their jaws. On some of these monuments, their bodies extend the full length of the slab, extending at the bottom, such as this example at Cossins. You can see how that ends in 2 little fishtails there. And then on others, they sometimes have a spear between their mouth, and they end at the arms of crosses or just at the top of the slab. The depiction of a man being flanked by 2 beasts is quite common, or the depiction of a man in the mouth of 2 beasts. And this is commonly seen in insular Scandinavian and Romanesque art, to the point that it's usually described as generic. But I think there's more to it than this. So for example, this recumbent grave slab from Meagle. So we have 2 beasts who rest their paws on a sphere, and suspended between their mouth is a man. So this is the same motif, but it's not framing the face of a cross slab. It's a distinct image in its own right here, which suggests that this motif was more than just a generic device used to frame monuments. It must have had meaning to the people who carved it. And these are quite common in Pictish Class 2 and 3 sculpture, as you can see from the examples listed here. Now, one of the things is sometimes it's quite difficult to tell when you're looking at this mythical imagery, what's mythical and what isn't. So for example, oxen or cattle with large horns occur on a number of these monuments, and they seem to be associated with mythical beasts, such as this example here at Cosson's. So in these artistic programs, sometimes it can be difficult to tell if you're looking at a supernatural animal or real one, or if you're looking at a Christian or a mythological image. For example, winged figures occur quite frequently on these cross slabs, and we've always assumed that they're angels, and with good reason. But in certain cases, we might want to be more cautious. So these are just some examples of the mythical motifs that were popular in Pictish class 2 and 3 cross slabs. And I hope I've shown there's great variety in their appearance, there's variety in what's included and where they're placed on the monuments. Regional styles and local styles are detectable, but none of these carvings are mirror images of one another. This suggests that they are artists' representations of the same concepts, not necessarily concepts they have seen in a book, but concepts that they have heard. Not all mythical characters are included on each monument. So for example, in this chart, the centaurs and the hybrid men are only found together on 2, possibly 3 monuments. So some characters are present, but in different contexts. So for example, on the Conan stone, the hybrid man fights a centaur, but on the Mirthly panel, he fights a bird-headed man. Now the hybrid man character is the same, but his opponent is different. So this suggests that they represent a different event in a story, regional variations to the same oral narrative, or different stories altogether that involve the same character. On cross slabs, these mythical creatures are either carved around the cross or in friezes on the reverse face. The dueling hippocamps are often placed alongside the cross shaft, perhaps because they had long bodies that were useful space fillers, and equally because some of these stones will have influenced local monuments. And we might have also had itinerant craftsmen. But there is considerable variety in the way in which these mythical creatures are placed and carved on monuments. And this is because, and this is important, Pictish art did not follow a linear pattern of structure and storytelling. Although certain characters and their associations seem to be grouped in relative proximity, the narratives this imagery was intended to evoke was not necessarily presented in a chronological order, or even on the same side of the slab. This makes it very difficult for us to recognize the patterns, but a Pictish audience will have recognized the significance of each character and would then be able to relate the longer narrative associated with each image. These reoccurring supernatural figures and animals had meaning for the Picts and must depict myths well known to them through a shared oral culture. I believe that at least some of these supernatural figures, if not potentially all of them, and the mythology associated with them are ultimately from the pre-Christian belief system of the Picts. This theory might be met with skepticism, which is fair enough, because after all, the majority of these are found around a dominant cross and intermixed with Christian iconography. But I hope to show now, so we're going to look at a comparison with a neighboring culture. I hope to show that the blending of pagan and Christian iconography was not necessarily problematic, but that it represents an important stage in the process of social conversion and religious integration. So let's turn now, looking southwards now to the Isle of Man in England, and we'll just do a quick comparison with how mythical imagery is depicted on insular Scandinavian art. So just to provide you with a bit of contextual background, Viking raids began in England in the late 8th century, and over the course of the next 3 centuries, there was extensive Scandinavian settlement in England, the Isle of Man in Ireland, and the Scottish Islands. Initially, the Scandinavian settlers adhered to their traditional religious beliefs, but gradually they became Christian. In addition to the Scandinavian sculpture from the Isle of Man, there's about 25 examples from England that depict or possibly depict scenes and characters from Norse mythology. Pre-Christian figures in Scandinavian Manx and English art primarily focus on the heroic tales of Waylon the Smith and Sigurd the Dragon Slayer. So those are sort of folk tales, and they also focus on the myths of the pre-Christian Norse gods. Ragnarok, which is the end of the world in Norse mythology, is a common theme. Today, we can identify these figures and relate their narratives on insular Scandinavian sculpture because a reasonably large body of later medieval literature on the subject survives. Now, there's a gap of about 2 or more centuries between when the texts were written, and they were written in 12th and 13th century Iceland and Norway in Christian context. But nevertheless, they do give us a reasonably good idea as to how these mythological scenes in Christian insular Scandinavian art would have been interpreted. Now, before we begin, let me make it explicitly clear that I am not saying that these mythical Pictish figures are Norse gods. That is not what I'm saying at all. I'm comparing the way in which legendary and mythological figures are depicted on Christian sculpture in a neighboring culture. So most of the evidence that we have for the Picts, such as onomastic evidence, artistic evidence, and documentary evidence, suggests that they're probably a Celtic people. And so their mythology is more likely to have been closely affiliated with that of their Celtic neighbors. So let's take just a few examples. So this is the Eurobee Cross slab from the Isle of Man. This is the cross here. And you can see this is a little image right here that is showing Sigurd killing the dragon. So the story, so this text, this survives in a number of texts, and I've selected 2 examples here at the top. So in the Volsunga saga, just to provide you with a bit of context, Sigurd, he hides in a pit and he knows that the dragon Fafnir is going to go over the pit. So as the dragon goes over the pit, Sigurd leaps up from beneath and stabs the dragon from underneath. And so you can see here that if you could imagine that this cross was turned on its side, here's the dragon and here's Sigurd and his sword right there stabbing the dragon from underneath. So this is a way in which, so there's movement in the literature. So the literary sources tell us that Sigurd jumped up from beneath to stab the dragon from the pit, from the pit, and he stabbed the dragon from beneath. So movement is evoked in the visual imagery here and also in the literature. So it's supported by the literature, which indicates that this must have been a feature of the oral tradition when this was carved. And this concept of specific movement of a character may explain why the hybrid figure on the Conan stone and the Mirthly panel are shown in a crouching position. This may have been a specific aspect of the story. Note as well on this cross slab how the mythological imagery fills the space to the side of the cross, between the cross and the edge of the slab. Depictions of myth involving the Norse gods are also found on insular Scandinavian monuments. For example, Thor's fishing trip, which is recorded in 2 texts, the Heimskringla and the Prose Edda. So this is displayed on the Gosforth, this fragment from Gosforth in Cumbria. Now, according to this myth, the god Thor and Hymer are fishing. Thor uses an ox head as bait, and he catches Jormungandr. Jormungandr is the Midgard serpent, and Jormungandr was one of the trickster god Loki's monstrous children, and it was so large that it surrounded the earth with its tail. One of these figures might be holding a hammer, and the hammer is an object commonly used to identify images of the Norse god Thor. If it were not for the survival of written literature to explain this scene, it is easy to envisage how we might turn to Christian literature and iconography for an explanation. For example, in Matthew 4:18, Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee and called to two fishermen casting their net into the sea and said, "Come follow me." And those two men became his disciples. Ragnarok, which is the end of the world, is another narrative. The end of the world in Norse mythology is another narrative encountered on Thorwald's cross on the Isle of Man. So in Norse mythology, this is the apocalypse, or the end of the world, in which natural disasters and great battles between the gods and the giants results in the destruction of the world and the creation of the new world. So in short, another of the trickster god Loki's monstrous children, the Fenrir wolf, breaks free of its chains and swallows the chief god Odin. And here is Odin being eaten by the wolf. And that brings about the end of the world. So this is the event that's depicted to the right of the cross here. And we can identify this figure as Odin, not just because he's being eaten by a wolf, but because he has a bird of prey and a spear, which are two symbols sometimes commonly used to identify Odin. Now, Ragnarok is a significant event in Scandinavian mythology, and it might seem like a strange narrative to depict on a Christian monument, but the two are not incompatible. The cross symbolizes death and resurrection, notably Christ's death, but also how those who believed in him would be resurrected to have eternal life. And so there are parallels here between both the Scandinavian mythology and Christian religion. So although these insular Scandinavian monuments portray images from pagan mythology, they are not themselves evidence of pagan worship or practice. This imagery reflects the process of accommodation in which elements of pre-Christian Scandinavian narrative have been integrated into the artistic and intellectual framework of Christian art. Now, the placement of these gods provides useful, the placement of these mythical images provides useful parallels for how we might approach the Pictish sculpture. Just like the Pictish cross slabs, the mythological imagery is placed around the cross, filling the remaining space with images that evoke longer narratives from the folk mythology. But if it were not for the fortunate survival of a large body of later medieval texts recording Scandinavian mythology and legends, we would have almost no way of identifying these gods and supernatural beasts such as Thor and Odin, and certainly not the narratives they represent. But when it comes to Pictlin, we have no text surviving to explain this, but both the Scandinavian cross slabs and the Pictish cross slabs present these mythological scenes in a non-linear way. So the Picts have left us with this incredibly rich visual culture of their mythology, but not the text to explain it. And now I'll just move on to the final part of this paper, because I realize that I have titled this paper The Pictish Gods, and thus far I have merely labeled these images as mythological. But I think some or all of them might originally have been gods in pre-Christian Pictish religion. Again, a clear distinction has to be made between pagan image and pagan religious practice. These images on cross slabs, like the insular Scandinavian comparison, are not actual evidence of pagan religious ritual and worship. To find evidence of this, we have to look to earlier Class I monuments. The carvings most likely to depict pre-Christian Pictish gods are the ones with human characteristics, and in these regards, the axe or weapon-carrying men stand out. As we saw earlier, they had a long currency in Pictish sculpture. Rhynie number 3 may be an early example, as one antiquarian interpretation showed this to be an axe, but it's now not visible on the stone today. But 3 that certainly belong in this category are examples from Rhynie, Mael, and Ball Blair. Rhynie, we know from the place name, was a royal center, and Mael also might have been a royal center as well, because the Norse names Koningsborough means the Kingsborough. So it's possible that it was a royal site that continued. Now, it's been suggested that some of these figures are wearing a mask, and to date, a ritual mask has not been, a Pictish ritual mask has not been discovered, but a wise friend told me never say never when it comes to the Picts. But the Rhynie and Ball Blair men are directly comparable to these figures on class 2 and 3 cross slabs. And if the Conan stone and the Mael figure are similar as well. Now, I think that these incised figures represent a Pictish god. Their archaeological context hint at ritual, and they are connected both in form and through the objects they hold with the mythological carvings on later sculpture. Now, most of these, as you can see, are depicted with an axe, and there's a variety in the types of axes that they are holding. So, for example, the Rhynie man is holding an axe with a long hammer, sometimes referred to as an axe hammer. And an example of one of these was found in the Sutton Hoo burial, and I've suggested elsewhere that this was probably a Pictish import. But the axe is one of the things, it's the object that they hold that links them. And the frequency with which axes are associated with this character suggests that it was the object used to identify this deity and will have played a key role in the cult of this god. Just as the hammer was the symbol of the Norse god Thor, the axe was the defining symbol of this Pictish god. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the linguistic and art history and documentary evidence strongly suggests that the Picts were a Celtic people. And we know very little about the pre-Christian religion of the Celts in northern Britain. We know a bit more about Celtic religion in Roman Britain, but it's always in a Romanized context. Now, one of the many exciting finds from Rhynie is the miniature axe pen, shown here in the top right. Miniature axes have been uncovered from a number of Iron Age Celtic and Romano-Celtic sites in Britain, France, Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, and they have always been found in sacral context, primarily temples or shrines. Because of their small size, they could have had no real function as a weapon or tool. Some may have been worn as jewelry, but it's likely that many of them were votive offerings to a specific god whose name eludes us. We're starting to learn more about ritual and rulers.
We are just reaching
the time. Okay. Yep. I think I have 2 more slides and then I'll be finished, if that's okay.
Sorry.
So that's okay. Oh, I know. Sorry, I can discuss these later. Professor Gordon Noble is in a better position to talk about these than me. But this is a detail of the recent excavations at Rhynie. So we know that the cross stain, one of the enigmatic Pictish symbol stones, was actually located at the entrance to this enclosure. And there is a stone socket here where it's quite likely that the Rhynie man was once situated. Rhynie number 3 was probably originally located in close proximity to these square enclosures. And this type of enclosure has been found at Forteviot and has been interpreted to be a shrine. So I think it's quite possible that these figure carvings are gods that were put on prominent display, marking out sites of pre-Christian worship. For example, in the Romano-Celtic world, it was common, if not the norm, to display images of the deity worship at a particular sacred site or shrine. So taking all the evidence together, including the ritual function of ancient Celtic miniature axes, the potential for shrines in the vicinity of these class 1 stones, and the placement of these mythological motifs in relation to a cross on later monuments, suggests that the formidable man and the beast-headed hybrid figures are a Pictish god. worshipped before the conversion to Christianity, but whose mythology survived to be depicted in greater detail on Pictish relief carved sculpture. So to be concluded, this is ongoing research. So I think the strongest contender we have for a Pictish god is the hybrid axe-carrying man. This mythology survived to be included in Pictish Christian sculpture, and the Picts used this native mythology and Christian iconography in meaningful combinations. Quite what it means, I don't know yet. I have some ideas, but I think further comparisons with Celtic and Indo-European mythology may shed more light on the pre-Christian beliefs of the Picts. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for this, Kelly, and that was a phenomenal paper, and I'm sure that there's a very large list of questions awaiting you. We agreed that we're going to go a little bit over for the questions because we need to give a little bit of space for this. And when we get toward the end, so around 4:05, Ian will take over for a little bit of housekeeping, because then we will switch to the next link for the rest of the afternoon. So you have about 14 questions awaiting you. We'll see what we can cover in the next 10 minutes. And then, yeah, let me start. So we start with a question from Victoria Thompson Whitworth. The man between framing beasts grasping their tongue on Dunfermline also appears in the Book of Kells with the halo containing crosses, so explicitly Christ. Do you see these as connected? And if so, in which direction do you think influence flowed?
I think they could have, the influence could have gone in both directions. So there are some examples, I'm trying to, I think, was it the Maiden Stone, where there's a man standing above the cross, and he's got two of these beasts on either side flanking him. That's a potential example where it is intended to be Christ. But if you were to compare, say, for example, if there's a native myth where a man is devoured by beast, and that in some way represents death and the afterlife and resurrection, that would not be incompatible with the symbolism of Christ. So I think, yeah, I think the imagery could have been interpreted in either way.
Well, there will be more discussions later anyway.
Okay,
but,
yeah, sorry.
There's more space for all of this. Moving to the next question from C.L. Gamble. Are there feminine warriors represented anywhere in Pictish art? I know Scathar appeared in the Ulster cycle, so there was a connection in those stories. And you mentioning Anne Morican reminded me that Scotland has a warrior woman, but she trains others rather than just loving a good fight. Alternatively, is it possible that women who performed more masculine roles are actually depicted, but in a way that we would term as cross-dressing, as we know that some skeletons that were assumed to be male in Scandinavia have turned out to be women?
When it comes to the Pictish mythical iconography, a lot of the more human type figures, it's impossible obviously to tell the gender of the animals, of the animal hybrid figures, but the human hybrid figures have a tendency to be shown wearing tunics, and if they do not have bird heads, they have beards, which suggests that they are men. And indeed some of the centaurs even have beards as well. So, I mean, there are representations of women in Pictish sculpture, such as the famous Hilton of Cadbolstone, and there's numerous others. But thus far, I've not found anything in the mythical imagery that specifically suggests there are female characters. But again, it's something that I cannot really apply gender to the animal hybrid figures.
So the next question is from Mike Holt. In the same way that Christian churches were often throughout Europe and Britain frequently built on the site of pre-Christian religious significance, where the cross is depicted on the Pictish slabs to signify a domination of the older mythical gods?
I don't know if it's necessarily intended to signify a domination, but it might be that Christianity has become the dominant religion. The cross is it's not just the defining piece of the monument, but it's also the thing that holds the whole monument together. And any sort of mythological imagery is very much sidelined. But this probably reflects a process in which early Christians had to sort of make a statement of this is the main religion now, but they're using the mythological imagery to get other messages across. So if you think about it, if you want to compare, for example, with the Vikings, when they arrived in England and elsewhere in the insular world, they will have encountered churches and monasteries that already had an established tradition of erecting crosses. But when early Christians arrived in Pictland, they will have encountered a culture that already had an established tradition of public monuments, and that's the Pictish symbol stones. So when Christianity was being established throughout Pictish regions, early Christians had to find a way to accommodate Pictish culture. And so that's why you still see symbols and probably the mythology from the Picts on cross slabs. So I wouldn't, it could be taken as a way of one religion saying we're the dominant one now. But it's also equally likely that they were using their native myths to convey messages that were not incompatible with Christianity.
And there's further than that, there's also the interplay between the imagery on the cross, but also the monument where it's situated within its wider landscape and kind of older monuments that are present in their vicinity, etc., etc. That's something that we see all across Northwestern Europe as well. Yeah. Guto Rees is asking, isn't the Gundestra Cauldron of Thracian manufacture, albeit commissioned by Eastern Gauls Celts?
I'm not entirely sure where it was manufactured. I think that's debatable. I think the last I read, most people seem to think it was from Gaul. I've also seen suggestions that it was made by the Iberian Celts. And yeah, so I think not where, because it was found in a bog in Denmark. So I think, but it shows strong links to Latin Celtic artwork. So I think, so I'm not sure where it was made, but it's definitely in a Latin style.
The next question is, there was a story of a Kelpie from where the Conan stone was found. Is anything known of the origin/age of the story? And is there any indication that it could be related to the hippocamp that is represented on the stone?
I do not know how old the Kelpie legend is. I have heard of it, but no, I honestly, I don't know how old it is, or indeed at what point the Conan stone, presumably it will still have been visible in 1796 when the other carving was put on it. But no, I'm not sure when the Kelpie story originated.
The next question from John is, when I reproduced the Conan stone as a wood engraving, I decided that the right side claw footed beast was missing head, with missing head shows a coxcomb of flowing crest rather than an ear. So I decided on a beaked head. Would John or Kelly agree with that interpretation?
So I'm sorry, so which one has a comb? The right one?
On the right side. I decided that the right side claw-footed beast with the missing head.
Sorry, I'll have to go back and look at the image. Oh, I see. So do you think it had a beak, more like a
So yeah, he decided that the missing head shows a coxcomb of flowing crest rather than an ear that is still visible. So I decided on a beaked head. Would you agree with this?
I think, if John will be in a better position to know than I am, but I mean, there's a recumbent grave slab from Meagle as well that has one of these sort of mythical beasts that has a beak. And it's got a strange bit of interlace as well. It looks like it's got what you might consider a coxcomb, but also a serpent biting its tail. Yeah. I don't know if John has anything to say about that.
Well, but that's actually a perfect segue to say that we're going to move on. There's a few other questions, but those are going to be moved on to the new chat, if you don't mind. And so like that, we can open up the discussion. So it was really my pleasure to chair this panel this afternoon. Thank you very much for those two incredible papers.